Hi everyone, welcome to another session on the Generative AI Awareness course. We're supported by Data to Sustain, eData, Regional Skills and Peace Plus, and we're running the course out of Atlantic Technological University. So this is a new session that has been added because the field has been changing so quickly. So we thought that it would be good to keep the course up to date. So we want to look at the evolution from chat workflows to agentic workflows. So if we look at how this kind of AI era started, we started with the chat era. So this was a single prompt, single response. The human would drive every step, and you would be copying and pasting between tools. So you might copy from ChatGPT and paste it into Word. Um, so this was really kind of human powered and AI assisted. So the next kind of, as you may have noticed, a lot of these tools started to add a lot more functionality in. So we could upload files, we could search the web, we could start to execute code that was written. So, as these tools advanced, more and more capabilities were added. And now the latest kind of evolution is this agentic era. So this is essentially an autonomous loop, and it will have multiple steps behind its reasoning, and then the agent essentially can execute tasks on your behalf. And of course, with the agents having full autonomy, there comes some risk. So we look at that as well. And the key shift really is that the AI is moving from answering questions to completing entire, multi-step tasks autonomously, or almost autonomously. We still will have the human in the loop, of course. We need to be careful with these tools. And essentially, we can see that in the chat era, it was human-powered, AI-assisted. With the agentic era, it's turned into AI-powered, human-assisted. So this is where the chat, you may have some productivity gains, but with agents, you're starting to see more and more productivity gains. So of course, with this new paradigm shift, there comes new jargon that we have to become familiar with. So some new terms that you might hear whenever you're exploring some of the concepts around these agents. So first of all, of course, the agent itself. This is just an AI system that can autonomously observe its environment, reason about the goals, and take actions. And it basically does this over and over in a loop without the human prompting it at each step. So essentially, the agent is starting to, it will have an output, and then it will basically use that as its own input prompt. And then it keeps going around in circles and circles until it gets to the exact, output that it wants or that the human has asked for. Skills are the next thing that you're going to hear about, and this is things like reading files, writing code, browsing the web, whatever it may be. You can kind of think of these like a tool in a toolbox, but a skill, another aspect is that we can take a task that is a repeatable task, and we can put that together in a skill, and we can reuse that skill over and over again. And very similarly, we can have things like the agents markdown file. You'll hear about that, and that's essentially where we can bake in our business logic. So all of the guardrails and all of the constraints that we want specific to our business, we can put these rules in here for the agent, so that we don't need to keep telling it the rules of our business every time. So it's kind of like a job description, or you can think of it as your business rules that the agent must follow. An agent harness, you'll hear that as well. This is essentially just a runtime environment or an integrated development environment. Essentially just a piece of software that manages the agent's execution loop. So we're going to look at this execution loop shortly. And there are different types of agent harness. So there's Claude Code, there's Gemini, CLA, there's loads of them at this stage, and there are more and more becoming available. And then MCP server, you're going to probably hear about MCPs, or Model Context Protocol. And this is essentially just a standardized bridge that connects agents to external tools. So things like your file system or your database or your email account, whatever it may be, the MCP server essentially connects your agent to the tools. So for example, if I wanted to copy the output from my chatbot to Microsoft Word, then I would have to normally manually copy and paste that. But with the MCP, what we can do is we can connect the agent automatically, so it can automatically write that text to Microsoft Word, and it saves us having to do the copy and paste. So the agent itself, like I say, it's an autonomous system that basically receives a goal and it breaks it down into subtasks, and then it may use tools, at different points, to act on the tasks that it's thinking about. And it basically evaluates the results, and then it will iterate over and over. So it will update the goal, and then it will break it down again into subtasks, and it will execute, each step, and then it will evaluate the results, and it will keep doing this over and over again without any human involved at all. So with the chatbot kind of model, this is a more reactive approach, where we kind of, it waits for the prompt, we give it a response, and then it kind of, it forgets at each turn as well. And we can't use external tools. With some of, the chatbots we can now, but we can't really do any orchestration or anything like that. So context is lost between, every time that I go to a chatbot, I basically have to say to it, tell it all about my business again, and I have to be very complex in my prompts. With the agent, this is more of a proactive. I can be a lot simpler with my prompts, and I can just give it a goal, and it will worry about working out what the steps, it'll plan everything that it needs to get to that goal, and then it will be able to act as well. So it'll be able to use tools to act out whatever the plan is, and then it essentially will keep going until you have the desired result. So it's essentially we are removing the human from the updating and the error checking of the chatbot's output. We basically feed all of that back into the chatbot again. So that's essentially what the agent is. And you can imagine that one of the things we have to be aware of is these agents are very hungry in terms of tokens. So every time that it goes through this, what we're going to look at now is the loop. And every time that it goes through the loop, the prompt gets bigger and bigger every time. So our tokens are increasing all the time. So the agent does one thing, and it does it well. It goes through this loop called observe, think, execute. So we start with, we put in a goal, and that'll be some kind of simple prompt, like I want you to build me a website. And then the agent, or the agent harness, the piece of software that will allow the agent to manage this loop, will essentially start the loop. So it'll observe, it'll see, it'll think about the prompt, and then it will start to execute all of the steps that it's thought about. And it will keep doing this over and over and over, and it will feed it back in, as a prompt, and then it will think, and then it will execute. So this will keep going until essentially an end result is met, or a condition is met that stops this loop running. So at the observe point, the agent really can read its environment. It can look at the outputs, the tool outputs. It can read file contents. It can, read the prompt, obviously. Gathers the current state of what the state of the current task is. The large language model will then reason, so it starts to think, and it will analyze the observations essentially. So everything that has been observed, it will do the analysis of that, and then it will start to think about what would be the next steps. So it starts to plan its next actions, and then it starts to do things like decide, do I need to call a tool, things like that. So it starts to lay out what needs to be done to get to that goal. It will also consider constraints at this point. So anything that we put in the agents.md file, essentially that will be our context, that the guardrails, the rules that the agent can't break, and these constraints will help the agent to not hallucinate and things like that. Then the agent can take action, so it can do things like run commands, write files and execute the code, or it can call tools from the MCP server. So maybe it wants to get access to your email account. Most agent harnesses will have, by default, a point here where before any agent is allowed to act, you essentially have to get approval from the human. So this is kind of built in, and you can turn this off and you can let the agent go completely autonomously. But if you're going to do that, there's other things that you need to be implementing. For example, if you need to audit how these agents are thinking and executing the tasks, then you might get another agent that is documenting what this agent is doing. As an example, if you so then you can basically follow the trail of if anything did go wrong. So let's look at an example of a small, agentic workflow for a small business. So let's say a local accountancy firm needs to process 50 client invoices. They want to extract key data and update a spreadsheet and email each client a summary, and they want to do this every single month. So we could set up the agent and we could give it our rules, and we could say, this is the only file system that you're allowed to look at, for example. These are the only folders you're allowed to look at, and we could have a folder that has all of the invoices in there. And this, we could also have the connections, the MCP connections to the email account that's going to send emails to the clients. So we would start with some kind of goal, like process this month's invoices, update the tracker, and email summaries to each client. So the tracker and all of that, it would know what I'm talking about because I would have them rules in my agents.md file. So I would have my constraints in there. So the agent would be set up and it would know what I'm talking about when I give this simple prompt. So first thing it starts to do is to use the file reading skill to scan the invoices and to start extract amounts, dates, client names, and all of the key information that needs to be extracted. So that would basically be added to the prompt, it would be added to the context window. So that's more tokens. And then the next thing is it's essentially going to start thinking about what it needs to do. So let's say it decides to batch update the spreadsheet first and then generate the personalized email for each client. So that might be a few steps. So then when it gets to the execute part, it writes the extracted data to the Excel file via some kind of code execution, calculates totals and flags overdue invoices. So it might go around again then, and it will maybe observe and say, right, I have the Excel spreadsheet updated, now I need to send the emails. And then it might go to the think state again, and it will start thinking, right, what do I need to do? And then it might draft an email and or connect to the MCP server, let's say to Gmail, for example, and then it will draft the email, and then that might go to observe, and it will review the email, and then it might go through this loop loads of different times until it is happy that it is finished with the goal. So it might draft up, and before it sends the personalized email, it might ask for approval from some human. So this is normally how a small business would use an agent, and it would be something simple like this. So they essentially put in this simple prompt. After the agent has been set up with all the constraints and everything, it essentially just executes this task itself, and then at the end we get some emails and some data that is going into a spreadsheet that we can approve as humans. So we're essentially orchestrating this agent workflow. So if we just look at a high-level overview of these chat versus agent workflows, so the interaction with the chat, we're single prompt, single response. With the agent, we put in a goal, and then it goes off and it does multiple steps until it gets a result. The human in the chat workflow essentially is the driver. They prompt, they're basically poking the model at every point. Whereas with the agent workflow, we just set a goal and then we review the outputs, before it does any actions that could be potentially harmful. For tool access, with the chat, it's manual copy and paste, but with the agent, we can just automatically connect into, for example, the email. For error handling with the chat, we would normally, as users, we would have to go back and forth with the chatbot and ask it to debug things. So that's basically, reducing down to almost a manual debugging process. With the agent, it essentially self-corrects, so it goes around in that loop over and over again until it has, exactly what was asked for. The context, normally in your chat, it's kind of lost between sessions. With an agent, it will maintain the context across sessions, and it can do this in different ways. For example, like the skills, we could set up a skill that it can call, a repeatable process that it can just do over and over again. Or we can have the agents.md file, where we have our constraints. So we have some background context that the agent knows about already. We don't have to keep giving it that every time. The complexity, so with the chat, we were just simple question answer, really it was basic auto completion. But with the agents, you can give them much more complex workflows. You can give them multiple step workflows. But a good rule of thumb is that an agent should just have one job, and it should just do one job really well. The orchestration then with the chat, it was human was doing everything in terms of orchestrating. But with the agents, we have these agent harnesses, and they're basically just a piece of software that do this, orchestration for us. An example in the chat workflow, we could say, write me an email. With the agent workflow, it might be draft, review, and actually send the email. So it's a lot more capable. And then the productivity gain, with the chat workflow, depending on how you use it, some people might not even become any more productive. But some people, they will get 2 to 3 times their productivity. But with the agent, some people are reporting that they're getting, something like 7 weeks worth of work done in 1 week. So, they can 10 or 20 times their productivity if they use these agents correctly.